for, ooh, that was so weird. Did you guys all hear that? Oh my God, that was so spooky. Yeah, so let's just, I guess, kind of start off with some initial thoughts that we all had about this wonderful play that Ashley has graced us with. Feel free to just kind of pop in whenever you want. Go ahead, Ian. Let's start with you.
Katie, I don't know if you said anything. You froze for a second.
I sure did.
Okay.
I sure was speaking to myself. I said, Ian, let's start with you.
Oh, okay, cool. This is like a super specific thing, but I love the choice of the name Mr. Olin. I was looking up the name, and it's for anyone who didn't happen to look it up, it's the various meanings of the name on Wikipedia, of Old Norse origin, of the ancestors or ancestors' heir or family descendant, and in Middle English from the word holly, the evergreen shrub or tree. And I just think like that, I don't know which etymology you had in mind when you picked the name, or maybe both of them. I don't know. I love that name.
Thank you. It's neither. It's the Finnish verb for to be.
Okay.
So is in for the Jewish name of God is I am.
Okay.
It's that in Finnish.
Okay. That's interesting then that the etymology that I stumbled across for it also kind of works.
Mm-hmm.
Rose.
Something that really struck me from the beginning was the ties to Peter Pan, because of how it's often presented as a metaphor for the afterlife, with Peter Pan being the Grim Reaper equivalent, bringing the children there, and that's why they don't grow up. I think that's why it was so shocking when we found out that she was continuing to age and that things were still happening, and that was a really interesting comparison to just keep coming back to throughout the play.
Did anybody have like any specific thoughts about I just feel like we should touch on the character of Richard. I feel like there's a lot to unpack there in that character. There's so much. Oh, I feel like I'm freezing
You're
again.
freezing up, love.
I can feel it. I can feel it when everybody on my Zoom stops moving. I was gonna say, just talking about the character of Richard, just kind of what our thoughts are. I feel like there's a lot to unpack there. Does anybody have anything they want to start off with that? Ian, we'll go back to you.
I mean, just in terms of reading the character, considering that I like to think I am not like that at all, and also, reading it in a pretty casual setting in my apartment, I'm obviously not going to be like screaming and shouting and swearing full voice because I don't want my neighbors to call the cops on me. But I'm trying to figure out how to word what I'm trying to say, but the idea of him perpetuating a cycle of abuse, and that somehow being framed as a justification, trying to excuse his actions because, well, quote, I'm not as bad as my father was. And the sort of almost double think that he has to engage in to both be fully aware that he's doing something wrong, but also try to justify it with these insane mental gymnastics of, oh, well, it's not that bad. It's not, I guess my question is, how do you write something so complicated, and when there's comparatively little dialogue from him addressing it, how do you write that and have it come through? Because it absolutely did, and I'm kind of blown away by that.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you. I mean, this whole play was challenging in many ways to write. And I think, I think Richard's a very challenging character to play because there are a lot of sort of mental gymnastics that need to go into it. But I think part of the key is I don't know how much he accepts or admits to himself that he's doing anything wrong. And I think that that's part of the key of it. But in terms of the writing of it, he was a very challenging, writing for him was the most challenging for me in this piece, I think. And I think the key was trying to have empathy for him and viewing things from his point of view and how he would filter that. And I think that the key then is to not necessarily make him a sympathetic character, but make him a real character. And that's, hopefully if you make somebody as real as possible, then the complexities just filter through, however much or little dialogue that they have to sort of go into the nuances of it.
I think, yeah, that makes sense. And that's honestly, that was kind of the scariest part of, even again, just in a casual reading setting, is the fact that he feels like he could be somebody that I've met before, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's really, really eerie, even just reading it by myself the very first time through. It's like, oh, this guy's like almost hyper realistic, especially compared to the slightly compared to like the memory play nature of everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think that that's part of the point of it. Any story like this would be a lot easier if that character is sort of a one-dimensional villain that we can all look at and just be like, oh, bad guy. But the point is, for whatever reason, nobody believed Kay when she was alive, that this is somebody who had friends and went out to dinner with people and had, a work life and whatnot, and was a functioning member of society, and that all has to be a part of it. And I think that that's one of the things that I wanted audiences to hopefully struggle and wrestle with, because the advantage we have in this setting is, as Lucy says, nobody's arguing about the evidence, like nobody's arguing about what happened. It happened. We can all see it, which is not something that we necessarily all have in life. And so I wanted people to wrestle a little bit with, if we weren't in the afterlife and if we weren't all on even footing in terms of these are the facts that happened, have I sort of, fostered a Richard that I know of, or, supported a Richard or whatnot. And I think that that's hopefully one of the things that people can look at walking away from this piece.
John, yeah, I saw your hand was raised before. John? Oh my God. I'm sorry, everybody.
Oh, okay. You're doing great. One thing tying off to what Ian said about the whole Richard character, a line specifically, I don't remember the exact wording, but it resembled to, don't forgive the deed, but forgive the man. Mm-hmm. And that kind of tying into the whole backstory of Richard and the backstory of his dad, which is a very short portion of this play. It's half a page, if I remember right. That was really intriguing because in a lot of different point of views, politically, etc., whatever, some people have isolated education when they're growing up from their parents. And a lot of people say you can't tailor your kid to think like that. But at what point is it the parent's fault, and is it the child's fault when they grow up? There's certain ignorance to things where you can only blame the parents for so long, because then those kids grow up and sometimes unfortunately become their own parents, and then fostering the cycle kind of continues throughout until something breaks it for lucky reason or not. So that's really interesting to me with that one specific line, because what Richard as a character did is, in my opinion, just not, he should take responsibility for his action, but that that I forgot her name, Arcadia, the fact that she forgave him was kind of tying into that line and the whole plot and that small little backstory of forgiving the man, but not him.
I think the line is, you don't have to forgive the evil, but you have to forgive the man.
Yes.
And the forgiveness, I mean, clearly this play is very much about forgiveness. It's at the center of the piece and sort of a complex look at it, whereas it's sort of an idea I think that often is very much brushed aside as just like, forgive them and whatnot. And I think it's an issue that we need to like look more deeply at. But I think what it really goes to is when Valentine talks about that really what forgiveness is, and it's the releasing of a debt, that it's a choice, it's not a feeling. And Kay makes a decision to forgive a debt. And then things play out as they do. But what she's really doing with that is releasing herself. She's not giving Richard a free pass. She's not saying that what he did was okay. She's releasing a debt, and she's breaking sort of the tie between herself and that situation, which ultimately is something that's freeing and liberating for her, and doesn't necessarily relate ultimately to what happens to Richard, which is something I think we're not necessarily expecting given the setup for it. But yeah, I'm glad that that was something that resonated.
Ian?
I would love to hear a little bit more about why Richard is so averse to feeling like a charity case that he would rather spend an eternity in hell than accept what's essentially a pardon. I think that's really interesting.
I think that's a great question. I think it's a really complicated question. And I think it just sort of goes to the heart of who he is as a person. I think it's one of the things that really the person playing the role, like, if you're doing a production of it, it's something to really delve into. And ultimately, I think those answers lie with the actor. I think maybe a short answer for it is I do think that Richard is dealing with some mental problems that contribute to it, such as narcissism. But I think it's also something where in order to accept the pardon and forgiveness means, as Olin insists, that he has to acknowledge that he did something wrong. And I think it's one of those situations where for him in this situation, acknowledging everything that he did and admitting to all the evil that he's done for him is worse than anything that he would have to be dealing with on the lower level. That he'd rather have his pride and be able to say that he was a good person who had just been horribly misused than to acknowledge I did really evil things and I need help. And that I think sort of goes to the heart of where his flaws as a person are. But how that's really interpreted and delved into is something I think that the individual actor probably has to figure out and filter through themselves.
I also think it's interesting how that kind of parallels what Valentine ends up saying at the end,
Mm-hmm.
where he has decided that what he's done is unforgivable and that he needs to face repentance for that. That was the other sort of bit of the ending that made me go, wait, oh, that's
Yeah.
like it's surprising.
Yeah. And it's not that he needs to face repentance. It's that he feels that he needs to be punished, and that like sort of no amount of punishment is going to make him feel absolved, whatever anybody else is telling him. But there is that moment at the end where he comes back, and, as it's written in the way that we staged it when we did it off Broadway, it's meant to be a question. Is he coming back to look at something that he can never partake in, or is he coming back making a different decision and they're going to go together? And that's something that's never fully answered. That's a question, but it sort of leaves it up to different possibilities.
I thought that was really interesting too. And going back to forgiveness, just like my takeaway from that was that forgiveness, like at the end of the day, is really more self-serving. Like you forgive other people, not really for their sake, but for your own sake.
I hope it's not totally that. I think that the way that it impacts yourself is very important and something that we don't always think about when we think of forgiveness, but it is releasing somebody else from a debt. And that means not holding hatred in your heart toward them. And there's that moment that it is addressed where like, what, we're just supposed to go up to the upper level and sing Kumbaya. And like, I think everybody feels that that would not necessarily be something that we'd really love to see that happen with Kay and Richard. But Kay has to be at the point where it's not just letting herself be free from the situation, but that if Richard was legitimately repentant, that she would be open to starting down the path of something healthy being dealt with there.
Okay, right.
Because I don't think it's true forgiveness if you're like, I forgive you for myself, but I still hate you. And I don't want to,
Yeah.
I ever want good things to happen for you. I think it's a releasing of the debt. And the thing that doesn't allow that to move forward is that he won't accept it. If he were to accept it, I think that's a lot of work Richard needs to start doing for that to be a healthy situation. We're also dealing with an afterlife situation, which is a whole different ballgame too. But I think that it's a mutual thing, hopefully.
Did anybody?
Why,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Carson.
I had another question. Why, maybe I just haven't thought it through. Does it take 12 years for Kay to be waiting? Is she waiting for Richard to die? Is that how long it takes him to die?
That's a great question. And when we were in rehearsal for it, it's actually something that we all really talked about and delved into. It's interesting because I wrote the play, but I also originated Arcadia off Broadway. So I've been at it sort of from both ends. The way that it sort of is from a structural point of view, from Kay's perspective, she died coming out of an extraordinary trauma. And I think both she and the people, in the upper level knew that she needed some time to just sort of like get some distance from it and, not be in the middle of that trauma. If an equivalent trial to what happens in the show had happened like 5 minutes after she arrived, I think it would have been so traumatic that she would not have been able to participate in it. But time also works differently up there. So we don't exactly know how it corresponds. For me as a writer, and I guess as Kay, the key is when Kay says, I would do anything to get out of here. And when she kind of reaches that point, it's the second she says that is when Valentine walks in. I think, knowing that Richard died is something that helped this process happen, but we're also dealing with a place out of time. And I think time is not necessarily linear up there. So it's not exactly the same as it would be out here. But I think the ultimate key is when she flat out is like, I would do anything to get out of here. And that's when it's like, okay, now we can sort of move ahead.
I was just wondering if anybody had like any moments of the play that really, really stuck out to you as being something that grasped your attention, where you were like, just kind of made your ears perk up, your head kind of turn a little bit. I know that moment for me is.
Hey, Julia, I'll just go ahead and call on you because Kate's frozen. I take the talking stick.
I've talked about this with both you and Kate before, but that Hazel Eyes monologue gets me every single time. And it truly is one of those moments that makes you really just fall in love with Mr. Olin, and just like it gives you all of the closure that you need after going on this journey. Because I think like there, we tackle forgiveness and mercy, but I think like that particular moment is just the epitome of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And just the epitome of being like, you're all my creations. And I think like with that, you also get the heaviness of the fact that could have been a reality for Richard, but he chose the path that wouldn't lead to that. And it, like, hearing it for the second time out loud, it really hit me with that, like, oh wow, it kills me that Valentine might never have that moment, that Richard will never have that moment, even though like Richard did horrible things. The fact that he chose that life for himself and will never experience that, it's less that, you know, I'm like, yay Richard, but I'm also like, I feel pity and just absolute pity for him in both his like earthly and post-earthly existence, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and I'm really, really glad that that is something that you're left with. That was a real challenge for me to do with that character as a writer, and I'm glad that it was hopefully successful.
Ian?
Yeah, I think Julia said it really well. The feeling of catharsis you're left with at the end, not in the yippee Richard is going to hell sense, but in the like that release of tension and emotion, where it's not, you're not glad to see him go. You just feel, it just feels like this is the way the chips ought to fall with that. And the other thing that I was going to say was one of the moments that stuck out to me was Margaret's speech over Arcadia's grave. It's heartbreaking. And I also, it's sort of like an inversion of the dead mom trope, where she is not the guardian angel protector of Arcadia. She's just a person trying to comprehend this immeasurable grief, and it's a really cool inversion of that trope that I feel like I don't see very often. And it even in the fact that she tries to crack a joke that somehow doesn't land even to her dead child, like it shows that she's not that she's another flawed human being like the rest of us.
Brenna?
Going back to Mr. Olin, I wanted to, like, one of the moments that really stuck out to me was, it was more of a character, I guess. The introduction of her teacher. I didn't expect like the integration of a father figure character to come in, and I thought that it was really a beautiful scene and like a beautiful moment of Arcadia's life that we, you know, got to witness and, you know, got to know, like, you know, she did have a little bit of a paternal presence that that didn't hurt her in any way. And I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that at all. And it was really nice.
Sabrina?
Hey, in the matter of scenic for like in your writing, how did you resolve on the idea of like creating this dreamscape and like this kind of null and void courtroom?
For me, that was always sort of a given when I set out to write it, of what it was, because I knew that for me, the majority of this play lives in sort of an Act 3 of Our Town kind of space. And as such, I needed people to be able to move very seamlessly between places and consciousnesses and observing themselves doing things and actually doing them. And so for me, the more minimal you get with that, the more fluid you can be. So for me, this was always a piece that was mainly painted in light, in the lighting design. And everything else kept very minimal, because the more literal and like scene changey you make stuff, the less sort of imaginative and ethereal you can be. So for me, that was always something that was very much a part of the piece. What was interesting though was when I wrote it, I sort of envisioned it in more of a proscenium space so that you could literally get like the courtroom balcony so people could be overhearing each other without seeing it and whatnot. When we ended up doing it off Broadway, we ended up doing it in the round, which completely changed that whole thing. So that threw some really, really fascinating things. And our director, Lori Petty, did some brilliant and beautiful things with that configuration. But
Did you
I
ever
knew
consider the round being able to be a turntable, which is becoming very standard in Broadway these days to have a turntable on stages?
Yeah, we did not have a turntable at all. It was just in the round. But yeah, I knew that the majority of this play was going to be taking place in sort of the courtroom of the afterlife, and the evidence was reliving scenes from their life. So I thought that the easiest way to do that would be to just live in this sort of liminal space and let the lighting and let the acting do the heavy lifting for you.
Rose?
There was one specific line of foreshadowing at the beginning, action Kay to partake in the trial by saying that she can pull some strings and help get her case through faster. And she says, I believe the line was, bureaucracy is hell.
Mhm.
And I think that was just a really clever way at the beginning to let you know that even though you're kind of on Lucy's side at the beginning, like you're not sure exactly what the dad did, but you're pretty sure you don't want him to like win any of this.
Yeah.
Her side is probably not the side you should be taking. And it actually made me wonder for like a split second if Arcadia was actually already in hell.
Mhm. Awesome. Yeah, I enjoy that line very much.
All right, folks. Well, with that, I think we're going to move on to the calls to action part of our talkback. If I freeze, I turn my camera off. I think it's helping. But if I freeze, Julie's going to take over for me. So I'm just going to quickly explain what calls to action are. We like to end our Disruptive Compassion readings with these. This is something that was coined by Caroline Shetler back at the very, 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 very beginning of Disruptive Compassion in 2020. And this is essentially how we're going to take what we learned from the play and find a way to tangibly put it back into society, whether that is a call to action that you have for yourself, a message that you've taken from this play that you want to then envelope on yourself, or if it's something that you want to go out into the world and do for the people around you. You know, if it's something like stop gaslighting people, or, you know, seek forgiveness from people, you know, whatever it might be. Those are the sorts of things that we try to take from this play and then put back out into the world. So we're kind of taking the message, quote unquote, that you learn, or the, you know, the themes, whatever it might be, and finding a way to actively try to make the world a better place. So does anybody have any calls to action they want to start with? Brenna.
Out predators and believe survivors.
Oh yeah.
Ian.
I think it can be, with stuff like this, it can be challenging to effect change on a broad scale, especially with the rising inaccessibility of mental health care in the country. But I think, you know, even something as comparatively small as getting people to really think critically about the concept of forgiveness and what does it mean, and the idea of forgiveness without absolving the person of their wrongdoings is a really interesting one that I don't think is often discussed when people talk about forgiveness. And having those conversations, I think, can be really important.
Julia.
This may be my exact same call to action from when we talked about trial on Playdate, but I want to really take an objective look at the systems around me and notice where we are protecting abusers and specifically groomers, and how to amplify the voices of children because like Arcadia in the show, so often it's just played off as, oh, it's just a moody teenager. But if we give children the protection and the vocabulary, we can solve these problems before you reach the age where you're looking back and you're like, oh my God, that happened to me.
Someone else go. I've been talking too much.
Sabrina?
Just to play off of what Julia said a little more, like adding on to it, that also just listening to each other is super important. Like when a child obviously speaks out something's wrong, we listen to kids, which I'm so happy that now with better parenting and like actual proper standards for some things, kids know how to kind of speak out a little more than maybe in the past. And also as friends, like reaching out, like when someone speaks up about something, take it seriously, make sure they're okay, even if it seems like a cry for help. If it's for attention, it's probably a cry for help. Always ask around, make sure your friends are cool, parents are cool.
Rose?
I think it's important to not only take a critical look at what's perpetuating the cycles of abuse, but to look at what we have in place to get people out of it, because I don't think it's much. And I think there are a lot of ways that we could probably improve that just aren't being looked at.
Yeah, I sort of said mine a little bit earlier, but gaslighting. Gaslighting is so big, and it's something that we come across in our daily lives, whether you notice it or not, in small ways. Maybe it's your boss at work. Maybe it's your friend who is, hasn't seen you in a while, and they're being a little salty about it. I feel like there's a lot of ways that we can gaslight each other without realizing the effects that has long term on each other. I think just in general, we're not, as a whole generation, we're more actively aware of how our words affect others, but not as much as we should be, frankly.
I'd love also to throw out on the other side of listening to each other, which is hugely important. One of the big impetuses for me to write this was I didn't hear anybody talking about this. I mean, obviously that's changed a bit in the wake of the Me Too movement, but something that was really wonderful and heartbreaking to me in the development of this piece is every reading, every performance, every presentation, almost the entire audience would come up to me and be like, I went through this, a friend went through it, a family member went through it, and you're the first person I've seen talk about it. And I think that still might be true to a degree in the theatrical world. Not that I'm the only person by any means, but the first piece talking about this specific issue in this specific way. And so I would also just say, if you feel alone with something that you've been through, you shouldn't have to feel that way. And if no one else is talking about it, that might be a call to you, if you feel safe and in a position where you can, for you to be the voice that's talking about it, because we need people that are sharing the stories. And if it's of interest to anybody, I heard a lot of conversation about like dismantling these systems and what's keeping these people in place. This play is based on a true story, and all of the things in it, for the most, I mean, obviously not the afterlife and whatnot, but are true and are based on real things. So things like the whole fad of parental alienation going through the court system is a real thing. And it's something that people don't really know about and should be looked up. And it's something that kept abusers in power of children for a really long time. And so a lot of those things, the difference between family court and children court and stuff. So if you're at all interested, those are places to maybe check out, because they're things that are still out there in various capacities.
Absolutely. Does anybody else have anything else that they would like to add? All right, fantastic. Well, friends,
I-
go
I
ahead.
do have a slightly interesting story about the Peter Pan references.
please do.
if that's of interest to anyone with that coming out. There's actually only 2 references to Peter Pan in the script. One is a stage direction, which is that Tommy has a Peter Pan-like quality about him, but the audience isn't aware of that because it's only in the script. And the other one is the stuff at the very beginning of the show. And the way that that came about was the opening of the show was originally a little different. It originally opened, Kay was there, but the woman kind of comes on immediately and the dialogue started a little earlier and whatnot. And it just wasn't totally working. There was something that wasn't completely gelling about it. And so when we were in rehearsal for the off-Broadway production, this is probably the most recent addition to the play, we were all there and Lori was making a comment about like it wasn't quite gelling and we were all feeling it. And she goes, Ashley, get a chair. And I'm like, okay. So I got a chair. I went on stage and the entire cast was around me. And it was a cast of people that to this day, I'm sort of overwhelmed that I got to be in a room with them, let alone have them in my piece and get to act opposite them. So even though I was the writer and in this, I was feeling a little intimidated. And she goes, just start improving, just like do something. And I'll tell Jenny, who is amazing, Jenny Burrells, who's playing the woman, to enter when like I feel like she should. And I was like, just improv. She's like, yeah, you've been there for 12 years in an empty room. What would you be doing? And I had a great learning moment as an actor because there was an instinct in part of me that got very nervous and insecure and wanted to start deflecting and asking a million questions to delay the moment of having to do this thing that I was terrified to do. Asking a million like clarifying questions to just sort of like put this off. And I'm like, you can't do it. And so for about 20 minutes, I think maybe it just felt that long, but I think it was a while. I sat on a chair in the middle of the room with all these people just sitting around me, staring at me, some of which, including Sarah Bareilles, are unbelievable improvisers, and had to improv what I would be doing if I were stuck there with just a chair for 12 years. And so I just went with my first instinct, which is I love to tell stories. And so I'd probably end up doing what I did when I was 5, which is just acting out stories in my living room. And I basically have Peter Pan memorized. So I just started acting out the entirety of Peter Pan is what I did. That whole thing was improved. The Wilson thing was improved. I did
one of my
bunch of other
favorite
things.
references.
Thank
The
you. I then
Wilson
had to go
reference.
back and double check when Castaway came out, because I have a whole, in the dramaturgy, I have a whole chronology, and I had to make sure that it sort of like had come out before Kay passed away, which that's a whole other story. But basically that came out of a giant improv of like, that's just, I guess, what I would do when I happen to know like all the words to Peter Pan. So I did that. That's also where all the first lines of the books came from. They're all things that I just sort of had in my brain that came out. And so I did that improv, and then Jenny came in at some moment. And so basically the vast majority of the whole beginning of that was completely improv, and improv between me and Jenny as well. It was interesting, actually. This is the first time I've heard it read by people, because we kept it sort of improv every night, and Jenny and I would kind of riff off each other a little bit and had things sort of set. And then with her exit, it would sort of really start scripted. So it was interesting for me to hear that completely scripted. So the Peter Pan reference was not necessarily meant as a deep subtextual meaning. But I think that if there is one, it's that what death was supposed to be for her was Peter Pan coming and taking her away. And that isn't really what did happen for her. So it's almost the reverse of that. But I love the picking up on there's a quote about Peter Pan that the only children that never grow up are the ones that die, which came out of J.M. Barrie and his history with his brother and why he wrote Peter Pan and Mary Rose and whatnot to begin with. But that's me nerding out. But basically that all came out as a very insecure improv that I did in front of Lori Petty and a lot of really incredible actors. And then it stayed in the script. So that's the backstory of the Peter Pan moment.
I love that. That's
I
so
also
funny.
really quick, I love the monologue about writing and what's what people get from it and what's real and like stories are real. That was going back to just one of the things that stood out to me. That's, I think, really beautiful and interesting when you think about like what is writing and what are stories and what makes something real and not real. I love that.
I love that moment, the Rothko monologue through talking about writing. And that's actually the first thing I wrote for this play. The idea and the impetus for it, that's a whole story in and of itself. But basically, once I decided to write it, and this was a piece I was very scared to write, I kind of knew that if I didn't do it quickly, I wasn't going to do it. So I wrote this entire play in 9 days. The first 3 were structuring, the next 3 were actually writing, and the last 3 were editing. But I didn't feel like I had once I did the structuring of it, I didn't totally feel like I had an in, and I didn't quite know how to start. And I've told Julie and Kate this story, but I was hanging out with a friend at the time, and he was about to go in to audition for the wonderful play Red. And it was a rainy day in New York, and he was going to go over to the Lincoln Center Library to watch the archival video of the Broadway production of Red. And I had never seen it. So I was like, hey, can I tag along? I don't have my show till later. I have nothing to do, and I would love to see the show. So I went with him to the Lincoln Center archives to watch it. And there was a moment in the middle of watching Red where you see that big Rothko painting that for some reason the entire monologue just came to me in one burst. I had nothing to write on. I had a receipt in my wallet, and I wrote the whole monologue really, really tiny on the back of that receipt, which I still have somewhere. But for me, it was the way in, because I realized that the way that Kate could express herself was through the metaphor of art. And once I figured that out about her character, the whole thing just sort of was clear sailing. So that is legitimately the very first thing that was written for the show. And that's where it came from. And I like it a lot too. So I'm glad you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that story. I think it's awesome. Well, I know, so many fun stories. My friends, we are approaching a little over 3 hours. I thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you all very, very much.
Time is one of the most precious things that we have. And while we aren't sharing physical space together, we are sharing our time. So thank you so much for spending your evening and spending your time with all of us here today. Just to reiterate a couple of the calls to action that we had here today. We talked a lot about, what it means to forgive people, believing survivors and outing our predators, taking care of our mental health, starting discussions with people and learning how to, forgive without absolving their wrongdoings. We like to take a look at the systems around us and notice where they're protecting abusers, listening to each other and taking a critical look at these cycles of abuse and how we can find ways to stop them. As Ashley said, people don't talk about some of this stuff as much as they should. So if you feel like you're in a position where you're going through something that you feel comfortable and confident talking about, please start that conversation. And let's continue to open up these platforms and these wavelengths of conversations between each other, so that we can help better understand and appreciate each other so much more than we already do. So I thank you all again so very much. Please take this time, take all of your time, find some time tomorrow, your week, your month to practice grace and practice disruption. We love you so much and we appreciate everything that you've done. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you all so much for having me, and
Thank
thank you
you,
for your
everyone.
beautiful work. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you,
We love you,
Ashley.
Ashley. Thank you so
all
much.
were amazing.
Yes.